Greetings, this is Griff Ruby with part 24 on my series Ecclesiology for Sedevacantists, based on Dogmatic Theology, Volume 2, Christ Church by Msgr G. von Noort. I continue on page 71. Scholium, the relationship of St. Peter to the other apostles and to St. Paul. It was pointed out above that a twofold sort of office can be distinguished in the apostles, namely the apostolic and the pastoral or episcopal. St. Peter's primacy pertains to the pastoral office, since it is nothing other than the full power to teach and rule the church, once the latter has been established. The whole church, in any event, at all times. He didn't say that, but I think we know that. And so, as far as the apostolate itself goes, the other apostles were not inferior to Peter. This explains, by the way, the meaning of the Father's frequent assertion that the apostles were on an equal footing. But in the pastoral office, they were subordinate to Peter. It is true that many theologians teach that each of the apostles received from Christ indefinite or negatively universal jurisdiction. By virtue of this jurisdiction, they could exercise episcopal authority over individual churches, even though these churches had been founded by another apostle. But even if one accepts this opinion, the jurisdiction of the apostles was on several counts inferior to the fullness of power granted to St. Peter. For A, it was not positively universal, and as a result, they, unlike St. Peter, could not exercise authority over all the churches at once, by issuing, for example, universal laws. B, it did not extend to the other apostles personally, but these latter were subject to Peter. Finally, C, it could not be exercised without reference to Peter, to whom they all had to subject their churches as to the root and foundation of unity. And anyway, not all theologians accept this teaching on the negatively universal jurisdiction of the apostles. There are those who teach that Christ gave each of the apostles episcopal jurisdiction under Peter over only those churches which they themselves had founded. And in the case where one of the apostles may have engaged in activity beyond the limits of this ordinary power, he could have done so as a delegate of Peter and in accordance with Christ's provisions for the needs peculiar to this first stage of the church's development. Finally, if it comes right down to the question of the exercise of primacy, it is reasonable to assume that Peter rarely, maybe not even rarely, exercised his power over the other apostles, not because he had no right to do so, but because the outstanding qualities of the apostles gave him little occasion to use that right. In fact, the frequency of charisms and extraordinary circumstances of this early period must have made it quite unnecessary for him to use his power of primacy very frequently. It's time to comment on that. This also relates to the nature of the authority of the Catholic bishops today, because obviously none of the bishops are Peter, so none of them has authority over the whole church. They do, of course, each have authority with respect to a particular flock that has been appointed to them, and that authority is therefore on par with that of any individual bishop or any individual apostle. And obviously, with the territorial thing no longer really quite the same picture that it was back then, there's going to be a little bit more crossover, as sometimes individuals or families may be subject to different bishops and so forth, or an individual in different periods of a person's life. And this is just part of how things are. But the key thing is, none of them claims to be Peter right now, because that office is vacant. That is the real meaning of when we say the church has no pope. This is not a commentary on what's going on in the Vatican organization. It doesn't matter what they do or think they do or don't have or whatever, because we traditional Catholics don't have one bishop whom we acknowledge as having authority over all. That, and that alone, is the reason that the Sede Vacante finding is true and indisputable. We Catholics, the Catholic Church, who hold the whole faith, are presently, and for quite some years now, and probably some years to come, I would expect, without a pope. That, and that alone, is what renders the Church in a Sede Vacante circumstance. Continuing. 2. Catholic doctrine on the primacy is not weakened by the fairly common custom of calling Peter and Paul together the princes of the apostles. 4. A. Custom itself shows that when Paul is linked with Peter as a prince of the apostles, he is not so called in the same sense, for while Peter alone is very often called the prince of the apostles, Paul alone is hardly ever so called, or is he ever so called at all? They don't seem to cite one. B. Venantius Fortunatus has explained the sense in which the title princes of the apostles is used. Peter is the prince of the keys, and Paul is the foremost in dogma, i.e., in preaching of the truth. Since, in fact, St. Paul worked harder than all the others in the establishment of the church, i.e., in the exercise of the apostolate in the restricted sense, he is rightfully called a prince in the apostolate and the apostle par excellence. Furthermore, Innocent X adjudged and declared heretical the proposition of Antoine Arnold, who affirmed the absolute equality of St. Peter and St. Paul without any subjection or subordination of St. Paul or to St. Peter in the supreme power and rule of the universal church. So it could really have been sort of like there was the Pope in Rome, and there was, let's say, for example, St. Francis Xavier, who converted more souls than Paul, I think, out in India in his day. So he was obviously a leader in a very real sense of the word, but that still didn't make that person Pope or equal in authority or rank within the church to the Pope. And I'm sure St. Francis Xavier himself would have readily enough attested to that fact. And so was the relationship between Peter and Paul in their day. Well, I think that'll be it for part 24. Thank you.